Welcome to English 3E. This is class 19. We are in week 5, I believe, unit 3. This is the unit we're working on. Looks like the beautiful girl on her journey, unit 3. These are the ways to reach me. I'm in the studio right now, so you can call the number 1-800-465-7144. During the day, I'm in the office, 1-800-667-3703. You can fax your work at 1-800-463-7852. You can also email me your questions, jillian.percy@nnecschools.org. If you want to rewatch a recording, I put them on YouTube. That is capital G, capital P, ERCY, space, capital W, AHSA. Okay, so first up, we were working on stuff on Thursday and we ran out of time. So I need to kind of finish that up first before we go on. All right, so we were talking about bias and learning how to watch a show for bias. This isn't an assignment. This is just kind of discussing the reading and helping you to be more mindful about bias when we're watching things. So first up was choose a new show to view. As you watch, take notes to answer the questions below. What are the top stories? What do you think of the order in which they're represented? Does each story qualify as news in your opinion? Explain. Are there words and pictures on the screen? How do they change how you understand the news story? Who is reading the news? How does that affect what you think of the news? And how do the anchors speak? Think about their tone and how they deliver the information. How do the anchors' word choices affect the information they give? And does the anchor give the information in a straightforward way? So one example that came up recently was with all the coverage of Ukraine, there was a lot of accusations about racism in how the media covered the event, not just like what was happening on the ground, but like that the media was overly concerned because the victims were white rather than of other races. So there's a little news story or news, I guess, opinion, I guess, in a sense, about that I thought was really interesting. And I wanted to kind of show it to you because I hadn't really noticed all they were saying until people like her were pointing some things out, right? So here
You've
it
seen
is.
how the world is responding. Now let me show you how the world is covering this invasion. I'm talking about the media, especially Western channels. How are they covering Russia's invasion? With blatant racism. Let me say something at the outset. As journalists, we do not filter hardships and pain. We do not see caste, color, or gender. And we have stuck by this principle. When the Taliban stormed Kabul, we stood with Afghans. When Ethiopia attacked its own people, we questioned them. When unarmed black teenagers were gunned down in the US, we joined the outrage. Today, we are doing the same. We see the plight of the Ukrainian people, and we have reported on their hardships. But what about the Western media? They too are reporting on the crisis, on the war, on the refugees. But they do not see hardships. They only see race, the color of your skin, the color of your hair. Let me show you exhibit number 1. This exchange happened on the BBC, the so-called Guardian of Unbiased Reportage. Listen to how their panel describes the refugees from Ukraine.
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed.
People with blue eyes and blonde hair. That is why the so-called expert on the BBC is emotional, not because the people are homeless, not because their country is being invaded, but because their hair is blonde. On social media, a lot of people are defending the BBC. They say it's a guest, not their anchor. Let me take you back to September last year. Another guest was speaking on the very same channel, South Asian expert Christine Fair. She called out Pakistan's links with the Taliban. Do you remember what the BBC presenter did? She shut her down. She said it was violating the channel's unbiased coverage. So exposing terror links is a violation. Blatant racism and white supremacy is fine. Gold standard indeed. Now for exhibit number 2, NBC News from the US. Listen to this.
These are not refugees from Syria. These are Christians, they're white, they're very similar.
very similar to us. How so? Because the Syrian refugees are Muslims, their skin is darker, their hair is not blonde. So Europe does not want them. And remember, this is not being said at some white supremacy cult. This is happening on live television. Exhibit number 3, CBS News, another American broadcaster. Their reporter is appalled by the war, not because there is death and destruction, but because it is happening in Europe.
You know, like Iraq or Afghanistan, this is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
So Iraq and Afghanistan are uncivilized countries. Their people are uncultured. Their regimes are irresponsible. So they deserve war. They deserve hundreds of bombs and years of occupation. What about Ukraine? According to CBS, no. Ukraine does not deserve war or hardships because Ukraine is civilized. And now for the final exhibit. This one is not from the West. It is from Al Jazeera in Qatar. This anchor simply cannot comprehend the idea of European refugees.
What's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
That reporter is confused about the refugees. They look middle class, they look like Europeans. How is something so bad happening to them? Well, this is what systemic racism looks like. Do you remember the 2015 refugee crisis? Around 1.3 million people sought asylum in Europe. Most of them were from Syria, Afghanistan and Nigeria. Do you remember how the West reacted? They shut their borders, they herded the refugees like cattle, and they branded them as terrorists. Back then, Western reportage was quite different. Let me show you what the BBC did. They prepared 7 charts depicting the refugee crisis. Let's focus on chart number 5. Which European countries are most affected? Now remember, this war was in West Asia. The bombs were dropping on West Asia, but this was the BBC's big concern. Which European countries are most affected? Now just to be clear, we welcome what Europe is doing to host Ukrainian refugees. They deserve all the help. Our question is, why just Ukraine? Ukraine is not a member of the European Union. It is not part of NATO. So what explains this level of assistance? Racism. You see, Ukrainians are Europeans. Hence, they get the red carpet. But Africans and Asians get border crackdowns and refugee camps. Western media is part of the problem, I have to say. They reflect the public mentality, their sense of European supremacy. And the problem is, governments are not doing anything to help. In fact, they're adding fuel to this fire. Let me show you what Bulgaria's Prime Minister said about refugees. I'm quoting. These people are intelligent. They're educated people. This is not the refugee wave we have been used to. People we were not sure about their identity. People with unclear pasts who could have been even terrorists. That was a European head of state. He is openly calling West Asian refugees terrorists. If this does not expose Western hypocrisy, nothing does. They invaded Asian and African countries. They waged war. They committed war crimes. And when the people fled, they shut their borders. What does this tell you? That refugees were never the problem. That money or borders were not the issue. The issue was race. Think about it. WION is now available.
All right, so I just discovered her. She's wonderful. So she's doing this kind of for us because she's in the field. She's seeing all the different coverage, and she's discussing, hey, are people noticing the racism that's going on from the anchors, from the reporters, from the experts they're quoting that are reinforcing this idea that that the immigrants from one country deserve more support than immigrants from another country have been given due to race, and also, as she points out, due to class, right? That because they're middle class rather than poor or perceived as poor, then that's affecting how whether people want to welcome them as refugees. So this is a really good example of why it's important to watch even news shows for bias. Like, news shows are supposed to be impartial, but they're still created by people, and people, like it or not, tend to have biases, and often biases they aren't even aware of. And so that's why it's important for people to watch shows with kind of their alert on, for those bias filters, and be willing to call them out, because as people call them out, then people are willing to change. People notice, oh, wait, I didn't realize that's how it sounded, or that's what I thought. I need to think about this. I need to change. I 100% believe that when we notice things for people, sometimes that they are very often, not always, but willing to change. I think that that's something we do for each other, hopefully. Step 3, this is if you're just watching more like a film, a TV show, or maybe even a documentary. So this is more in the fictional narrative kind of category rather than just in news. So first is describe the program. What's the stated point of view? Now, often if it's a film or a TV show, it won't necessarily have a stated point of view. It may be more like, okay, Big Bang Theory. We're gonna look at a group of these kind of nerdy guys who are really smart and watch their sort of adventures and stuff. Audience, who's the target audience? Anytime you're looking at a TV show, the people who've created it and the people who've spent all the money to make it have thought about who their audience is and whether that audience is enough of an audience to watch a certain type of show. So what's the age? What's the gender? What's the social class? What's the level of education? And they're not mentioning here, what kind of disposable income do they have, right? Because a lot of times TV shows and that kind of thing, they're making money off the ads. So they have to be able to prove to the people that buy the ads, hey, if you're selling, cars or whatever, the kind of people that are watching this show have enough money to buy cars. If you're selling fashion clothing, well, this is a younger crowd that cares about fashionable clothing, right? The target audience has to be shown for the advertisers. It's just that simple. What is appealing about the program to the target audience? What is advertised during the program? And are the ads appropriate to the audience? Is there product placement in the program? Product placement is when you'll see the characters in the show use real life products. Like, so for example, if a character opens up their computer and it's a Mac computer, that's product placement, right? Generally, not always, but generally, someone has paid money for that product to be advertised on that show. If somebody's wearing a Nike hat, that's product placement. And again, normally advertisers are paying for that because those are the best kind of ads, because people don't even notice them as ads. They just kind of see, oh, hey, here's this cool character that wears this particular kind of clothing or drinks this particular kind of drink or owns this particular whatever, and I want to be like them, so I'm gonna buy that kind of stuff too. Portrayal of characters. How does the program, my apologies, how does the program show women, men, teenagers, and seniors? So sometimes the program is shown from like the men's point of view, and they don't really, show women very positively. That's very common. Or it can be shown from like a younger point of view. A lot of teen shows, all the adults always sound like they're idiots, right? Or the seniors always sound like they have dementia, even when, in real life, people that age wouldn't necessarily have dementia or something. Do you feel there's bias in the show? What kind and towards whom? Would members from each of the groups above listed think there's bias? How does the program show people from various cultural backgrounds? Is there bias in how they're shown, and what is the bias? Does the show portray people as stereotypes? If there are jokes, are the jokes prejudiced, and do they target specific groups of people? What message, if any, do you get from the jokes? Now, so for example, thinking of jokes, like thinking about Friends, there's a spot at which the characters, there's this coffee shop they always go to, and the characters are always sitting on the couch talking. And at one point, all the characters are sitting there and they're talking about, hey, my boss hates me, and my boss doesn't like me, and my boss hates me. And one of the other characters says, hey, maybe it's because you're all sitting on a coffee shop couch at 11 o'clock on a work day. And everybody gets up and leaves. So that's a joke that isn't targeted towards any group. It's not showing prejudice. It's funny based on what the characters are doing, right? Other jokes, I'm not going to repeat any, sometimes maybe more prejudiced, maybe jokes against women or certain races or certain age groups or ableist, right? Against handicapped people. What's the overall theme of the program? And what is the main message that you as a viewer get from the program? Now, even when shows are meant to be like funny and stuff, they still often have a message, right? And it can be really, sometimes it can be hard to discern over like one particular show. But if you watch, say, a season of a show, you may begin to get the message of like, maybe the message is doctors are human too and make mistakes. Maybe the message is, people in authority are evil and it's really important to protest. Or, it's cool and funny to steal as long as you're clever about it. Or there's all sorts of messages depending on what kind of show you're watching, right? So hang on, go to the next thing. These are some shows that have been flagged as using lots of inappropriate stereotypes, including sexism, racism, etc. South Park, The Simpsons, Big Bang Theory, Friends, Two and a Half Men, Home Improvement, Hawaii Five-0, Broke Girls, Sex and the City, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Many of these shows are really popular despite their bias. This is one example of how bias can be affecting us without even realizing it. We don't even have to be watching the show ourselves. Someone else in the house could be, or you go to work and people are repeating jokes that they heard on these shows. It also has a lot of influence on what's considered socially acceptable. People often feel that if so many people like it and laugh at these shows or aren't offended by the shows, then it must be okay. So obviously this isn't true, but that is the assumption. And interestingly enough, some of these shows, for example, even people who acted on the shows will sometimes say, oh my gosh, like there is this problem and that problem with this show. And like the Two and a Half Men, the guy, I know one of the guys that was in that was like, please don't watch this show. This is terrible. There's The Simpsons. There's a portrayal of a character called I think it's Apu. I'm not sure. I haven't watched the show for a really long time. That was a very racist portrayal of that character. And the actor who voiced that character has since apologized for that. A lot of times shows that are popular can still have racism. So it's just part of like watching things with your eyes wide open to be aware of the stereotypes you see and to be aware of them so that they're not affecting you, right? The media has a lot of different ways to affect or influence the public's perception of events. Check out the link below for some of the ways that media can affect our understanding of events and manipulate people's opinions. When we began this lesson on Thursday, we were talking about some of the ways, and it was just a very small list really, but some of the ways that media can affect how we view things, like by commission, by omission. Interestingly, there's a really long list of different ways that the media can affect how we see things. And when I saw this, I was really kind of amazed. Is this the right one? I hope this is the right one. It's not necessarily the one I was thinking of, but oh yeah, it does. Okay. So spin. Spin is a type of media bias that means vague, dramatic, or sensational language. When journalists put a spin on a story, they stray from objective, measurable facts. Spin is a form of media bias that clouds the reader's view and prevents them from getting a precise take on what happens. So here are some examples of spin words and phrases: emerge, serious, refuse, crucial, high stakes, tirade, landmark, latest in a string of, major, turn up the heat, critical, decrying, offend, stern talks, offensive, facing calls, meaningful, even though monumental, significant. Sometimes the media uses spin words and phrases to imply bad behavior, right? People in a protest can be compared to terrorists, or they could be compared to freedom fighters. Those two words have different connotations. colored, dramatic, sensational words as a substitute for said. Mocked, raged, bragged, fumed, lashed out, incensed, scoffed, frustration, erupted, rant, boasted, or gloated. And here's an example. President Donald Trump gloated over mass layoffs at multiple news outlets on Saturday, tweeting that many others will follow and attributing the loss to fake news. Now, if they had used the word said is gender neutral, like not gender neutral, sort of emotionally neutral. And then people could have just looked at his words and made their own decision, right? By choosing the word gloated, there's an attempt to kind of manipulate how people see what got said. Unsubstantiated claims. Journalists sometimes make claims in their reporting without including evidence to back them up. This can sometimes occur in the headline of the article or in the body. Statements that appear to be fact but don't include any specific evidence are a key indication of this type of media bias. Sometimes websites or media outlets publish stories that are totally made up. This is referred to as a type of fake news. Now, the headlines is really commonly, you'll hear the phrase a lot these days, clickbait, where the headline sounds outrageous and crazy, and oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. And then you click on the actual story, and the story is nothing like the headline. The headline was just included to get people to click over to the story, again, to make money. So here's an example of an unsubstantiated claims media bias. Socialist Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez continued her long-standing pattern of not understanding how things work on Thursday, this time indicating that she does not know the difference between a media company and a political party. So this is two things. Yeah, it's an unsubstantiated claim, but it's also kind of a subtle put down, right? If they were just reporting, they would just say what she's said and let people make their own minds up. But because they're commenting, they're giving their opinion. The thing is, news reporters are not supposed to give their opinion in news articles. It's considered inappropriate. Opinion statements presented as fact. Sometimes journalists will use subjective language or statements under the guise of reporting objectively. Even when a media outlet presents an article as factual and objective news piece, it may employ subjective statements or language. A subjective statement is one that is based on personal opinions, assumptions, beliefs, tastes, preferences, or interpretations. It reflects how the writer views reality or what they presuppose to be the truth. It's a statement colored by their specific perspective or lens, and it cannot be verified using concrete facts and figures within the article. So for example, some things are objective. If I describe something as blue, old, single-handedly, statistically, domestic, I can point to what those things are, right? On the other hand, there are subjective modifiers that automatically include an opinion: suspicious, dangerous, extreme, dismissively, apparently. All of those are words that give people an impression, but aren't things that can be backed up necessarily. Maybe dangerous if you were talking about, say, firearms or something. Interpretation can present the same events as two very different incidents. For example, a political protest in which people sat down in the middle of a street blocking traffic to draw attention to their cause can be described as peaceful and productive, or others might describe it as aggressive and disruptive. We looked at that when we talked about protests, the Oak crisis, and the protests that were going on, how the different wording affects how people think about things. So some words that affect that are things like good, better, best, is considered to be seemingly extreme, may mean that, could, apparently, bad, worst. It's likely that, dangerous, suggests, would seem, decrying, and possibly. Let's see what else we have here. Twitter banned or suspended several high-profile journalists Thursday evening a move that further reveals the seemingly arbitrary decision-making of Elon Musk, a self-avowed free speech absolutist. Now, they underlined seemingly, they didn't underline arbitrary, even though arbitrary is another one that's kind of a value judgment, right? They're providing their personal opinion on what the type of decisions are. And again, as a journalist, they should simply be reporting what happened and letting the readers decide what to think about what happened. Sensationalism or emotionalism. This goes a little bit to spin. A type of media bias in which information is deliberately presented in a way that gives a shock or makes a deep impression. In recent years, some media outlets have been criticized for overusing the term breaking or breaking news, which historically was reserved for stories of deep impact or wide scale importance. So, for example, the Ukraine war was breaking news. That was huge. But, there's a music festival downtown is not breaking news. Okay. With this type of media bias, reporters often increase the readability of their pieces using vivid verbs, but there are many verbs that are heavy with implications that cannot be objectively corroborated or confirmed. Things like blast, slam, bury, abuse, destroy, worry. Other words that might signal sensationalistic types of journalism: shocking, remarkable, rips, chaotic, lashed out, onslaught, scathing, showdown, explosive, slams, forcing, warning, embroiled in, torrent of tweets, desperate. So for example, AP, which is like oh well, I won't go there. There'll be plenty to gawk at Friday when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un walks south across the world's most heavily armed border and stands face to face with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Two men who seemed on the verge of war months ago will take a pleasant walk, plant a commemorative tree, inspect an honor guard, and belly up to a lavish banquet. Gawk means to stare or to gape stupidly. I would also say that belly up to a lavish banquet is somewhat sensationalistic types of language as well. They're sort of treating this more as it's like silly or goofy when actually it's quite a serious event. Let me see here. Trying to just give one example, otherwise we could be here literally all period, which we might still be. Mudslinging. Mudslinging is a type of media bias when unfair or deliberately insulting things are said about somebody in order to damage their reputation. It's sometimes the ad hominem is the Latin for to the person attacks, where you're attacking a person's motive or their character instead of the content of their argument or idea. Ad hominem attacks can be used overtly or covertly as a way to subtly discredit somebody without having to engage with their actual argument. So an editor from a place called Reason called a New York Times columnist a snowflake after the columnist emailed a professor and his provost to complain about a tweet calling him a bedbug. Now, snowflake is kind of considered an insulting term, right? That you're fragile. Inside the mind of Ben Shapiro, the alt-right sage without the rage. Kind of a descriptive, kind of an insulting description. A alt-right, there'd be a lot of questions to whether that's what he is, but the sage without the rage is very clearly kind of sensationalistic language, right? Mind reading is when a writer assumes that they know what another person thinks or thinks that the way they see the world reflects the way the world really is. So, for example, Donald Trump's hatred of looking foolish and Democrats' conviction that they have a winning hand is leaving the president with no way out of the stalemate over his border wall. Now, neither of those things can be proven. They're both essentially opinions because you can't read the person's mind. So it's poor reporting. Going on. Slant is when journalists tell only a part of a story we talked about that slant is where you're looking at omission, right? They've left off part of the story. So I'm not going to go into that. Flawed logic is a way to misrepresent people's opinions or arrive at conclusions that are not justified by the given evidence. Flawed logic can involve jumping to conclusions or arriving at a conclusion that doesn't follow from the premise. So, for example, two-time failed presidential candidate Hillary Clinton snubbed Melania Trump during George H.W. Bush's funeral on Wednesday, refusing to shake her hand or wave at the First Lady after the other former presidents and their wives did. Here, the Daily Wire interprets a video to draw conclusions that aren't clearly supported by the available evidence. The video shows that Melania did not extend her hand to shake, but it could be because Clinton was too far away to reach, or perhaps there was no particular reason at all. So also they're putting it all on Hillary Clinton, but here Melania did not raise her hand. So by jumping to conclusions, by kind of creating a false logic here. Bias by omission we've talked about. Omission by source attribution is when a journalist doesn't back up their claims. So often journalists will name who told them something. Now, sometimes they don't. They'll say an unnamed source, like high in the White House administration, right? Sometimes they won't name somebody if naming that person is going to get them fired, for example. But somebody usually knows who that is. And if, for example, it had to go to court or something, it could be proven who said it, okay? Here's an example. The Journal's coverage has drawn criticism from outside. In late November, after Mr. Trump falsely claimed on Twitter that millions of people had voted illegally, the paper was derided online for printing a front page headline that parroted Mr. Trump's assertion without pointing out that it was inaccurate. Now, here they link to the Twitter that Trump issued, but they don't link to the information that would show you whether the claim is actually false or not. So they're saying it's false, but they aren't linking to what they're saying, how they're deciding that it's false, basically. Bias by story choice and placement. This is simple. This is they don't have to choose to cover stories that they aren't interested in, but that can be deliberate. Like if they say deliberately didn't want to advertise or discuss the happenings from a certain race, they, like in the past, they deliberately wouldn't report on certain kinds of stories, or they wouldn't report on positive stories. Bias by story placement is, there's a phrase called above the fold in the newspaper, and if it's on top of that fold, it's like everyone's gonna see it because that's what shows in the piles of papers. So anything that's up there is a priority. So you can promote a story by putting it up top, or you could deliberately discourage a story by putting it under the fold or deep inside the paper. Bias by viewpoint placement is related to the story placement. A balanced piece of journalism will include perspectives from both the left and the right in equal measure. If a story only features viewpoints from the left-leaning sources, or includes them at the top and doesn't include any right-leaning viewpoints, or buries them at the end, that's an example of bias by viewpoint. Like they've chosen the ones that they think are important first, and the other ones get kind of like second string. And remember, we've talked about how the bottom of a news story is where things get cut off. All right. Not going to go into that. Word choice, we kind of already talked about. Photo bias is one that I thought was really interesting. When somebody in the news wants to make somebody look bad without necessarily writing about it, often they can just choose an unflattering photo. Their mouth's open, they've turned red, their hair is a mess. This is a really common way to try and influence how people think of that person. And if only one paper does it, okay, fine. But if all the papers do it deliberately for like one particular political candidate, it can really have a really strong effect on how people view that person. Is every time they see them, they always look really strange. Hang on. Negativity bias is a type of bias where reporters emphasize bad or negative news. If it bleeds, it leads. I'm sorry, it's a terrible phrase, but it's a really common saying in the newspaper that the worse it is, the more people want to read about it. But that becomes a thing where then people read the news and think, oh, things are so terrible. Well, are they terrible, or is it just that the news didn't bother to report on everything and anything good, you know? Elite versus a populist bias. Elite bias is when journalists defer to the beliefs, viewpoints, and perspectives of people who are part of society's most prestigious credentialed institutions. For example, academic institutions, government agencies, business execs, and nonprofit organizations. Populist bias is where journalists defer to the perspectives, beliefs, and viewpoints of those who are outside prestigious institutions. For example, man on the street stories. So a reporter can have either type of bias, right? This also in the US, and I think in Canada as well, has a bit of a geographic component. For whatever reason, larger cities tend to vote more liberal, and rural areas tend to vote more conservative. So this is an example of an elite bias. This one, for example, see, and I wouldn't call that an elite bias. This is one where they're talking about wearing masks, and so they're quoting all these authorities, which makes sense because it was kind of a controversial thing. Here is one that's against masks, and so they're quoting kind of people on the street sort of thing. All right, I think we're kind of finished. Yep. Sorry, that took longer than I meant for it to take. I apologize there. Okay. I wanted to quickly cover a couple of things that have been coming up. One of the reasons we have you guys hand in rough copies of your writing is to track that the work is your own original work. While I do look and want to see the substantial revisions, there should still be some obvious similarities between the two pieces. I'm going to question a good copy if it sounds completely different than the rough copy. So I know there's people that are redoing this course. If you're redoing this course, please make sure, don't hand me in your old rough copy, but your new good copy, especially if they're completely different topics, right? If you're redoing the course, hand me in the new rough copy with the new good copy, or hand me in the old rough and the old good, okay? It's got to match. So for example, if you had free choice on a paragraph and chose to write about snowmobiles the first time, but the second time you write about hunting traditions, you need to give me the rough draft that matches the good copy, okay? Because I am looking for specific things. It's pretty hard to mark if they're completely different. Rough copies must be written in sentences when I ask for rough copies to be sent in. I don't always ask for that. And they have to be in paragraph format unless the assignment specifically says otherwise, okay? Notes that are in a jot format, like this with a little dash, and it's just kind of not really a sentence. These are considered a form of pre-writing or brainstorming. So let's say my topic was about where I grew up. These are the jot notes from that. Windsor, semi-big town, lots of outdoor activities, friends in high school, first job at a pizza place, volunteer with handicapped child. These are my notes about what I want to write about, but I haven't actually written. So I couldn't hand that in as my rough copy. I would have to actually write. So for example, I grew up in Windsor, which is semi-big for a town. It is over 200,000 people. We did a lot of outdoor activities growing up. I was always outside playing road hockey, baseball, hide and seek, and tag. There was always a whole bunch of kids outside to play with. Now I can see right now all sorts of things I would change if I was making this my good copy, but it's a valid rough copy, okay? Please be careful. If you hand in jot notes, it will bring down your marks because most times it will specifically say in the assignment that the rough copy has to be in paragraph format. At this point, you need to assume that's in paragraph format unless for some reason I said differently, okay? A quick word on slang and short forms. I've had A lot more of this happening lately. Most of us have grown kind of used to using short forms and slang when we're writing text and Facebook messages, and that's fine, right? We're saving time, we're writing on tiny little phones. They don't really have any place in assignments you submit to this course, okay? This course requires academic writing. For one thing, I may not know the slang or shortcuts, or I may misunderstand them to mean something different than you intended. So here are just some short examples of short forms. You need to make sure you spell these out in full words. K for okay, you got to write okay. FR for real, you got to write real. Though that isn't the correct spelling of though, you got to write the whole thing. THOUGH. TBH, to be honest. LOL, laughing out loud. UR for your. F for you, the letter U for you. IDK for I don't know, or IDC for I don't care. Those short forms can't be used in your assignments, okay? If you want to use them during, like messages to me, that's fine, but not in your assignments, please. Writing tip, parallelism. One way to make your writing sound smoother is to use a technique called parallelism. It's usually used when we're writing about items that are in a list or a series, or even just a pair of items. It's often, they're usually phrases. It could be just one word. The idea is that the series of items should all have the same grammar structure. So for example, a list of adjectives describing someone or something shouldn't suddenly include a verb phrase. So for example, if I write, the building was tall, majestic, and cost a lot of money. Well, tall and majestic are adjectives. This should be an adjective too. That's what makes sense if it's a series. But instead, I've used cost a lot of money, which is like a verb phrase, a verb with like a predicate. The sentence will sound better if we choose an adjective that not means the same thing, but like means the same thing, but is also an adjective as well. Okay. So like expensive means the same thing and is also an adjective. So writing the building was tall, majestic, and expensive is an example of parallelism where we use the same structure. And it's because it's a series, right? If it was all on its own, it doesn't matter. But because if it's a series, it sounds wrong and it can be confusing grammatically. All right, so here's another example. One mistake would be when people write a series of verb phrases and then they add a different part of speech, such as a noun. For example, he loved swimming, running, bicycling, and pizza. It would sound better if a similar verb were included. So these are all ing verbs. So we really need an ing verb here too, not just a noun. So I could write, he loved swimming, running, bicycling, and eating pizza. That works. If you had written the sentence with verb phrases, you would want to continue using verb phrases. So for example, if I wrote, he loved swimming in the pool, running in the park, bicycling down the trails, and eating pizza at the cafes. So this time I'm using verb phrases that all start with an ing, but I'm including like a little prepositional phrase afterwards. Another common mistake would be when people write a series of verb phrases using a certain tense and then switch to a different tense. Like if I'd written swimming, running, and bicycled. Well, that wouldn't make sense because swimming and running are in present tense and bicycled is in the past tense. Okay. How can we fix these sentences with parallelism? Note, there's always more than one way a sentence can be fixed. I'm only suggesting one way. You absolutely could write these differently. I'm just kind of giving you an example. Her favorite activities were ice fishing, skating, and hockey. What's wrong with this? Okay, so looking at these, ice fishing, skating, and hockey. First of all, ice fishing and skating are verbs. And hockey is a noun. Although in this sense, they are kind of using them as a type of noun called like a gerund, but it might be better to change the hockey into including an ing phrase too. So for example, her favorite activities were ice fishing, skating, comma, and playing hockey. And that way you've kept the format of the INGs there. His list of things to do that day included picking up a prescription, buying groceries, garbage, and dropping off a package. So again, we've got a series of things here. And what sounds different? Picking up a prescription, buying groceries, garbage, dropping off a package. Okay, we have a bunch of verb phrases here, except for garbage. Garbage is just a thing, it's not a verb phrase. So I'm not going to write the whole thing over. I could say putting out the garbage or taking out the garbage. I want to put that, I guess, taking out the garbage. And then you're following the same kind of format. To be a successful dancer, you need three things: grace, great legs, and coaching. This is kind of funny, but it doesn't really quite work because grace is a thing. Great legs are a thing, a noun with a description. And then coaching is a verb. I could put another thing. I could say, and an awesome coach. And then I've got another noun. So parallelism is just the idea that if you've got a series of phrases in a row, try to keep them the same grammatical structure. It sounds better on the ear, but it's also less confusing. If you switch structures in the middle of a series, it sounds like you're starting like a whole new sentence there. Often. I think we've finished all of that. We've just finished how to identify bias. And we're starting today to work on this. We're running short. Sorry. We had to kind of finish up yesterday's stuff. So quickly, don't give up on the media. You need to read that. I would normally give a summary and discuss it, but because one of your assignments is a summary, I'm not going to discuss it here today. And then there's assignments 12, 13, and 14, which I don't have a lot of time to discuss. This is a style of writing called an editorial, okay? It's expressing an opinion. This is not news, it's an opinion. This is from the Edmonton Journal newspaper. The big overall argument seems to be that we shouldn't give up on watching media because it's showing so much bad news. Okay, and instead we should be demanding better news coverage. I was going to go into the text and then I realized I couldn't really. Yeah, it's our summary. I can't. All right. This is a nice short assignment. In the newspaper editorial, don't give up on the media. You will read a line which states that the crime rate is declining in Canada as well, while Canadians think crime is getting out of control. Why do you think the writer mentions this? Please include at least 2 sentences. It's worth 3 marks. This is a relatively short assignment. It does not need a rough copy, and it does not need a good copy. Whatever you write is what you write. Obviously, still try and make it sentence format, but you don't need to do anything special with that. This is the next assignment. We're going to talk about this tomorrow. I'm running out of time to talk about it today, but I will just kind of mention the assignment. I'll mention the assignment, and we will talk more about how to do it tomorrow, okay? Number 13 is, many people say there is too much violence on TV. What is your opinion or thoughts or feelings on this topic? In your response, comment on whether or not violence affects you or others, especially children and young adults, in any way. This is going to be 1 paragraph containing at least 6 sentences and 8 marks. So tomorrow we're going to talk about opinions and how you think about your opinion and plan it, and how you write about an opinion, okay? So I'm going to kind of stop there because we are running out of time for today. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you had a wonderful long weekend, and we will talk again tomorrow.